Hello everybody, today I'm going to speak about Karen Armstrong's A History of God, right? Before I begin, a little bit of, and so that you are able to see this in perspective, I strongly believe, even though I have not read a lot of Karen Armstrong's work, I strongly believe in authors like Karen Armstrong, right? As much as I admire authors who believe in religion as a force governed from the top, I also believe I strongly align to religious figures who believe in fundamental principles, including religious liberty. And that's exactly where Karen Armstrong comes from, right? When she's able to talk about all the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam and Christianity together, that means she fundamentally believes in religious liberty. Now some people might argue that okay, she's not talking, and there are very small instances where she talks about other religions. Like I read a small quote about Gandhi, and in it she talks about Gandhi as a reformer, not the way you talk about Gandhi in the Indian context. You talk about Gandhi very differently, but in this book she talks about Gandhi as a reformer. There's this lack of talking about other religions. It's primarily restricted to Abrahamic religions, which might be a potential critic of this book, but net she advocates for something that I'm closely aligned to, which is religious liberty. So let's get started with the three topics that I wish to talk about within this book, right? Three chapters that stood out to me in today's context. The very first chapter that stood out to me was unity or tenet of Islam. I'm not sure if I'm remembering the name of the chapter correctly, but that's broadly what the chapter was, right? And I wish to tie back and the way, and that's what struck out to me, the way someone like Karen Armstrong, who has a background as a nun, is able to justify Islam as a religion was perhaps the biggest win of this book, according to my own perspective. She talks about three things primarily, which completely stood out to me when I read this book. One, she talks about how Islam is perhaps at one point in time was one of the most feminist religions. Now, Islam and feminism are not concepts that you would probably relate together, right? They're two very. She talks about how the veil was something Prophet Muhammad's wives alone used, right? And then later, and it was a mark of respect, which when the Abbasid Caliphate came in, more people started to adopt, etc. That's one angle that she takes up. Another angle that she talks about is how Islam was one of the first religions where women were financially independent, where financial independence was talked about. The third aspect that she talks, and these are all examples, right? I'm just taking a cross section of a chapter and then talking about the same. And then there's this later part where she talks about how she talks about women empowerment in detail. So not just financial independence, not just the veil, not just other aspects with respect to Islam, but also how initially when the he or the male concept was there in Islam, it was changed. It was there just for interpretation. It wasn't the he, and he or the male gendering of God is something that's common across religions, but she talks about how it was not really meant for a particular aspect, and then later the way you interpret it made it what it was. And finally, perhaps a sub-note that she adds is, and perhaps it comes from her own biases, I might have my own biases as well. A topic that she talks about is how when you have rigidity in texts, when you apply texts rigidly for what they mean in textual form itself, that's when there's a gap in interpretation, right? So net when you read through, and it's a topic that and I started off my discourse on this particular book with this topic because it sounds to me it struck out that somebody, a nun could talk about a religion and call it progressive when in fact a lot of us believe the opposite. That's perhaps one of the biggest highlight in the book, right? And finally, and this is, I'll start the book from the back and then move on towards the front. So the very final chapter in this book is, does God have a future? Does religion in itself have a future? Should we believe in religion? The answer is a resounding yes. Now she divides her arguments into 3 parts. The very first part is, and this is me interpreting the book as well, so in case any of you have any doubts, do ask, is what I keep saying. Since the video, I don't think we'll be able to ask doubts, right? A topic that she talks about, and if I remember right, she talks about how feminists oppose religion because of the he perspective, which I talked about earlier. But net, the primary tenets of feminism came from the Abrahamic religions. The primary tenets of equality came from Abrahamic religions, right? The second topic of conversation becomes, the scientific community, will the scientific community help religion to move forward? And then an answer that she gives, and this is her viewpoint, right? Whether it be Newton with his laws of motion, or whether it be any other scientific person, their belief in science is also stems back to their belief in God, right? I'm not sure who it was, but there was this famous scientist who calls God as a celestial mechanic. For someone who is a fan of mechanics in life, I completely agree with the same, right? Because at the end of the day, you can make things function, but who started it off is always a question we like to debate, right? And the third major opposers of religion, say, are conservatives in the sense that believing that there's only one religion. And this is something that she mentions at some point in the book. I think it was the last chapter, where she talks about how hardline stances on religion necessarily kills all other religious beliefs, right? So sometimes when we promote one religion, it necessarily kills another religion. It's a normal belief concept. So that's where, so what I started off was with an essence of the book, right? Where Karen Armstrong as a personality comes from is what I started off the book with. Now let's go chapter by chapter, right? It's a really long book, so just talking about any one chapter is not what I'd want, right? So there's this point in the book, and where she talks about Muslim fundamentalism has toppled governments and either assassinated or threatened the enemies of Islam with death penalty. Similarly to Jewish fundamentalism, where they occupy territory of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with avowed intention of driving out Arab inhabitants using force if necessary. Thus, they believe they are paving way for the advent of the Messiah. In all its forms, fundamentalism is a fiercely reductive faith. Thus, the late Rabbi, the most extreme member of Israel's far right until his assassination in New York in 1990, said, "There are not several messages in Judaism, there is only one. And this message is to do what God wants. Sometimes God wants us to go to war, sometimes He wants us to live in peace. But there is only one message. God wants us to come to this country to create a Jewish state." And then it goes on to talk about Judaism, right? The God of Jews, Christians and Muslims got off to an unfortunate start since the tribal deity was murderously partial to his own people. Essentially, when one reads this and when one interprets this in the current socio-political context, the first thought process that one has is the Israel-Palestine war, right? But even before that, even if that is just the first layer of thought process, the very fundamental layer of thought process that one probably has is, where does it stem from? Does it come from the Arab? And I'm just asking questions. I have no opinions of my own. I'm just asking questions based on this book, right? There's this instance where it talks about how Abraham had 2 sons, as any follower of any Abrahamic religion knows. One was Abraham's son out of Hagar, and one was out of his long-term wife, right? So one was Isaac, one was Hagar, one was Ishmael, and there's Hagar, and Ishmael had descendants who were the Arabs, and Isaac had descendants who were the Jews. And perhaps the fact that Ishmael was never respected is perhaps the biggest question mark that this book also talks about. It just mentions it, but the fact that someone not in a position of power was able to talk about it, was able to talk about the roots of conflict, because every conflict has a root, right? And the fact that she actually took the effort to talk about the roots of a geopolitical conflict, which stems in essence from a religious conflict, is what makes this book powerful. Every single aspect in this book, whether it be say a geopolitical conflict, and I'm just starting off with it. Another topic that this book talks about is casteism. It talks about how in Vedic religions people had experienced a holy power in the sacrificial ritual. They called the sacred power Brahman, and the priestly caste known as Brahmins were also seen as microcosm of the whole world. Brahmins gradually came to mean a power which sustains everything. And nor does it so thanking or praising for, and then it goes on, and finally it says that some of the Upanishads saw Brahmins as a personal power, but others saw it as strictly impersonal. The fact that someone who is not from a country in which there's a conversation on casteism can actually talk about caste is another reason why this book is powerful. But an alternative critic is the way she talks about, when she talks about the history of God, she extensively talks about Abrahamic religions. She doesn't talk about other religions. So it's a critic. So it's an external person's viewpoint, whereas it's not a person who is say, I mean, do you have the authority to talk about something that you do not belong to? Is a question that people usually ask, right? So when she talks about Brahmanism, or when she talks about caste, that's a fundamental question that rises, right? Do you have the authority to talk about something that you're not part of? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the fact that she raises that concern is something that we need to take note. There's more examples of, say, Brahmanism, but I do not wish to quote about the same, right? The third topic that she talks about is the god of, and how she talks about Christianity as a whole, right? I'm just taking examples from every religion so that this book is very relatable. So the Christianity, as we all know, has different sects and sects upon sects and then subsects. It is not just Catholicism and the Protestants, but there are several sects, right? And there's this point, and this is perhaps a major contention in a lot of Christian academic circles, right? How Catholics and Protestants were insisting that the Bible be factually true up till every detail, and this would make traditional religious mythology vulnerable to the new science and would eventually make it impossible for many people to believe in God at all. So that goes back to a topic that I was earlier talking about, and the topic is, to what extent do you interpret a text for what it is, and to what extent do you extrapolate the text? And all religious debates come from this very fundamental question, right? I think while this book review was happening, I've gone slightly all over the place, but given this context, let's just get back to one last good bit of the book, right? And this is perhaps something that's perhaps very essential, and that's perhaps what drives this book. If you think about religions, right, there are hierarchical religions, there are flat religions. Some religions are very hierarchical, some religions are very flat. Islam is a flat religion according to this book. Other religions are hierarchical religions. But what stands out is religion and the centrality of God has lost touch with the modern world. This is also sentiment that echoes in this book, that has religion and God lost the touch with the modern world. This book says no. As I mentioned earlier, there are people who say yes, and this is where I wish to end this debate. How do you make an abstract concept still relevant, and there are numerous other stories, right? How do you make a concept so abstract, so confusing for a commoner who is not so confusing for a commoner become something that they can relate to? And once you build in that relatability aspect, it is at that point, and Karen Armstrong has tried to build that relatability aspect, has tried to do that research, and has tried to bring in that research into her work, showing that, okay, the concept of God, it's not something that you blindly believe in, it is something that you can potentially, it is something that exists, and the fact that someone taking that pains to put all those footnotes, etc., is perhaps the essence of the book. And I'll just wind with one last sentence, and we'll finish the book. It talks about how Plato was so continuously occupied with problems of epistemology and the nature of wisdom, and how much of his earlier work was devoted to the defense of Socrates, who had forced men to clarify their ideas by his thought-provoking questions, but had been sentenced to death in 399 on the charges of corruption of youth. In a way that is not dissimilar to that of the people of India, he had become dissatisfied with the old festivals and myths of religion, which he found demeaning and inappropriate. And Plato had also been influenced by the 6th century philosopher Pythagoras, who may have been influenced by the ideas from India. Maybe at the end of the day, in every single book, the place where, and this is a question that I have, and it's not just with respect to this book, right? When you talk about, and this is a question which I'd like to end with, can someone who is not part of a faith talk about the faith and achieve enough traction the way that Karen Armstrong has? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I'd like to end the book there. Thank you.